Welcome to the new sound of online radio. Welcome to the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network.
'Cause you make me feel like I've been locked out of heaven.
A mix of today's hits and hard-to-find favorites, combined with the most entertaining and intriguing talk anywhere. This is your sound. This is the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network at uenradio.com.
You're listening to The Dr. D Show about neuropsychology and well-being. Get the knowledge you must have to live a powerful, positive life. The Dr. D Show. Here for you.
Welcome, listeners, to the Dr. D Show today. I am excited to have you with us. As usual, regular disclaimers. This show is psychoeducational in essence. It is not meant to replace professional mental health advice or therapy. If you do believe you suffer from a particular disorder, please do reach out to professional help. With that in mind, some of the topics that we cover on this show are not appropriate for the younger population. Hence, your discretion is advised. The topic of today has been one that should be a major concern for us socially and worldwide, in fact, and that is the troubling increase in methamphetamine use all over the world, and also, of course, in the United States. We are blessed to have with us today an interview with a scientist and a professor who has been investigating interesting correlations between methamphetamines, meth use, and some of the medications that are derivatives of a similar chemical makeup, which is Adderall, particularly today. We are going to talk about this topic and see what do we know about the similarities of the two. What do we think and what do we assume potentially could be the effect on individuals? What is the professor's experience with investigating into the substance, and what do we learn from that? Just to talk a little bit about meth use, and I, through neuropsychological evaluations, occasionally face an individual or a patient that is suffering from addiction to meth. Addiction to meth is a very violent addiction for many individuals who know about it. When I say violent, I mean that it takes a significant and major toll on individuals. It is an addiction to a chemical, a man-made chemical that quite drastically affect all areas of functioning of an individual. It's a chemical that is violent in the sense that it eats away physical functioning of the person, the look of the person. You can go online and find many sites that show a comparison of an individual before and after a dramatic and drastic change in the way that the person looks, how quickly their body ages and basically becomes consumed and destroyed by meth. Meth is relatively cheaper in comparison to other substances on the black market. It is readily available, unfortunately, on the streets, and therefore it is at a higher an increased risk of individuals abusing it. Unfortunately, the numbers are skyrocketing. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated worldwide production of amphetamine-type stimulants, which includes methamphetamine, at nearly 500 metric tons a year, with listen to this number now, with 24.7 million abusers. 24 million people who abuse this drug. The United States government reported that in 2008, we're still talking about now 8 years ago, approximately 13 million people over the age of 12 have used meth, and 529,000 of those are regular users. We are talking about gigantic and enormous numbers. Let's talk about the fact that it's a substance that's used with, notice the number, 12 years old. This is the population that uses meth can be very, very young, teenagers, children practically. Okay, young teens that get introduced to this drug that eats them away so, as I like to call it, violently. In 2007, 4.5% of American high school seniors and 4.1% of 10th grade students reported using meth at least once in their life. So, and that again is in 2007. Other sites that discuss this one is from drugfreeworld.org, but other sites that discuss statistics show a tremendous increase of use of meth, amphetamine, and other types of similar products of in terms of chemical compound from 1990, where it was just under 2,000 of kilograms use. Numbers have grown in 2000 to 14,000 kilograms. You could see a gigantic increase, and on and on and on we go up until today. The numbers are so high that this is becoming a social epidemic that eats away our young. Once one starts using it at a very young age, a lot of the cognitive capacities and physical resources that the person has become significantly destroyed and eaten away. And many of those capacities are not something that it's easy to regain back. So as individuals in society, we need to be extremely concerned. We need to pay attention to our young and who has access to our young. We need to pay attention to what happens to them, because that can determine and often does the course of how turbulent and challenging their future can look. With that in mind, I also want to mention that often lower level substances are the gateway or the first door to heavier substances. So some ask me, well, what is your opinion about using marijuana? And there are times that using marijuana is appropriate for certain medical conditions, legitimate medical conditions, individuals who suffer from chronic pain, individuals who have other more significant physical problems. But otherwise, for younger individuals in particular, many of them can run the risks of going into serious and more severe abuse of substances, of other substances, in which it would be much more difficult to recover from and to successfully get rid of as a habit or as an addiction. One has to understand that when individuals use substances, it affects a gamut, a collection, a variety of factors for that person. And when we talk about brain functioning, we include, of course, decision making. We include communication. We include many factors, and those are not limited to just one thing. With that in mind, I believe we have our exclusive interview today with Dr. Carl Hart. Do we have Dr. Hart yet? Not quite yet. He's coming on board with us. While we're waiting for Dr. Hart to be with us on the call, it seems that is he with us now? Okay, great. Hello, Dr. Hart.
Hi.
Hi, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
We're happy to have you with us. Dr. Carl Hart is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Psychiatry at Columbia University. He has published nearly 100 scientific articles in the area of neuropsychopharmacology and is a co-author of the textbook Drug Society and Human Behavior. His most recent book, High Price, A Neuroscientist's Journey of Self-Discovery That Challenges Everything You Know About Drugs and Society, was the 2014 winner of the Penn E.O. Wilson Literacy Science Writing Award. His essays have appeared in multiple popular publications, including the New York Times, The Nation, Epony, and O Globo. Brazil's leading newspaper. Recently, the city of Miami issued a proclamation declaring February 1st, 2016, Dr. Carl Hart Day. Dr. Hart, it is absolutely our privilege to have you on with us on this show. While we
I'm
were
happy to be here.
well, wonderful. And with your permission, I'm going to give a little bit of a review of what I just began talking about while you were coming on board. Some of the concerns that listeners have who communicate with us to this show have a lot to do with substance abuse and have a lot to do with lack of education out there that has to do with the various substances, and often something that is missing for younger individuals. So by the time that they actually achieve an opportunity to learn about these substances, sometimes it's later on in the game than we would have liked to see. When I went ahead and was introduced to your article on Vice, although it's been a little while from now, I actually really enjoyed reading the analysis as to and your story that has to do with what got you involved in research and investigation into the area of methamphetamine. So with that in mind, perhaps you can first educate our listeners to your journey as how did you arrive into that process?
So how did I arrive at, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
Sure. How did you arrive into the interest in investigating into this area?
Oh, I see. So I started studying drugs in part because I wanted to learn how the brain worked, and drugs were excellent tools for understanding how neurons work or brain cells work. And then as I started to learn more about the brain, of course, I wanted to know why people became addicted to drugs. And that's related to how I grew up. And I grew up in the most exclusively black community in this country. We tend to say negative adjectives to describe those communities, and I bought into that hype, and so I thought that the community was what people said it was, and it was that way in all of those negative adjectives, and I thought it was that way because drugs were destroying the community. And so, of course, I wanted to try and solve some of those problems. So now, armed with this information about how the brain works and how drugs affect the brain, that maybe now I thought maybe I could solve drug addiction. And then as I started to study drug addiction and trying to come up with cures, I discovered that much of what we have been taught about drugs as a society is just wrong, and it does more harm than the drugs themselves. And so that's kind of how I got started.
That's very interesting. So what kind of examples can you give us on some things that are being taught wrong in terms of knowledge about drugs?
Knowledge about drugs. All right, let's think about what the country is losing its mind about now with drugs. Let's think the opiates, the prescription opioids and heroin. The way we talk about that in the country today is just ineffective, unhelpful, and actually harmful. Let's think about the real issues that we worry about when we think about opiates. The real issues that we worry about is drug overdose, deaths, and addiction, which are serious concerns, and we should be worried about them. But we talk about deaths, which is the most serious concern. We talk about the role of opioids in the deaths of people who have died as if the opioid itself was the primary reason that the person died. And when in fact, that's just simply not the case in most cases. Maybe more than 75% of the people who die from an opioid-related death do so because they combine opioids with other drugs, other sedatives like benzodiazepines, alcohol, and other sedatives, and other drugs, even antihistamines. And so these sort of things, the public can benefit from correct knowledge, because if we know this knowledge, then we can now inform people, hey, if you're going to use opioids, do not combine it with another sedative or a drug that has some other potential additive effects with opiates, particularly the respiratory depression additive effects. So these are the kinds of things that trouble me about what we're doing with our drug education today.
Okay, and let me ask you this question though. From a, for clinicians, when we see someone who has a substance abuse problem, they often have difficulty making decisions altogether. Their brain functioning is impaired. Their memory is impaired, and they're often severely emotional and depressed. How likely are they, even if they have, I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit, how likely are they, even if we do tell them that information, how likely are they to actually follow it or remember it at the time that they decide to use?
That question alone can take up this whole hour.
That's
so let's
true.
break
That's
that
true.
question down one by one, because there were so many assumptions in that question that was just flat out wrong. When we think about people, first of all, most people who use drugs are not addicts. Only about a quarter at most are addicts. And so, but there are people who die and have these problems, and they may die and they're not an addict. So we want to make sure we understand who we're talking about. But let's just focus on that smaller percentage who are addicted to drugs. That's just the notion that they are cognitively impaired. That's one of the things that happens in the literature. The literature certainly has said that. And my area of interest, or one of my areas of interest, is deals with methamphetamine. I think that's the drug that people had said, reported in the literature, that people have more cognitive problems than any other drugs. And so what I did recently, I published a paper. It came out in 2012, where I critically evaluated the entire literature that looked at cognitive functioning of people who were methamphetamine addicts. And then when you look at that literature, including the brain imaging literature, when you look at that literature, you find that the literature, the actual interpretations of the literature, including by some of the scientists, many of the scientists, in fact, the interpretation of the findings are wildly exaggerated, and they are not consistent with the actual data. And so I tried to set the record straight in that 2012 paper. I tried to set the record straight in my book, High Price, to show that even people who have abused methamphetamine for years, are not cognitively impaired. Now, they may not do what we want them to do, and there could be, I'm sure there are a variety of reasons for that. But when it comes to like cognitive impairment, the evidence simply doesn't support that position.
From a clinical perspective, and I've tested a lot of individuals with substance abuse, hundreds of people by now, there are times that they are impaired. There are times that they are not. It depends also. You must differentiate between, or one must differentiate between people who had long-term use to people that used for a shorter duration of time, whether they mixed it with other substances or not. So I do agree with you on that. And it depends on other factors. So if they use it when they're very young, you might see some things, and you often do see better recovery, a lot better recovery. But if they used it in an older age, you might not see the same. You might not see full recovery of cognitive functioning. But I don't know that to say that there are no cognitive functioning after problems after using substances. I mean, would that be something that you're saying that there wouldn't be any cognitive problems? Because neuropsychologists would say there would be.
I am saying that. I am saying that there are people who have cognitive problems and they use drugs, and they probably had cognitive problems before they used drugs. And now, I obviously cannot say everything that people use, because we know that some street drugs with neurotoxins, for example, that are worse than the parent or the desired compound. That's true. But this notion that we have this sort of widespread or impairment in this population is just simply not supported by evidence. That's just simply not true.
Okay, so and I see your perspective, and some clinicians say that work in the substance abuse environment would say that they see more impairment. Other ones say that they wouldn't. But in terms of
but I'm a little troubled. I'm troubled here because we have to be careful when we start talking about what clinicians say. I mean, I too work in clinics, tons of clinics, and can come up with stories, but anecdote is not evidence, and we have to be careful that we do not slip into this sort of clinician bias, and also we are not careful to differentiate between anecdote and evidence.
True, true. And I think that there are other factors that fall into studies. So one of the things that's most difficult in analyzing different studies that are coming up is looking at other factors that can affect the result of the study. And that is one of the areas that studies do find themselves. Many studies do find themselves very weak on. So many factors were not controlled for. And one of the other areas as well, or the main factors that I always see, is that there is no good baseline to begin with individuals. So you really have not investigated into other types of problems and other types of damage. Although, a study would say, well, we ruled out for certain disorders or not, it really was not looking into previous conditions properly to discern whether there was or there wasn't a cognitive impairment. Go ahead.
I'm a little troubled by this line of reasoning. No study is perfect, and we
Sure.
understand that all studies have their limitations. But that's why you do multiple studies, and then you do multiple studies with different methodologies and different sort of ways of conducting the study. And the idea is to do this sort of diverse technology or diverse techniques, and then you have convergent findings, taking into account all of the potential limitations. But you can come up with something that reveals that can increase our confidence in what we're actually seeing.
Of course.
So,
Of course. That's without a doubt.
I'm troubled that we would dismiss studies based on the fact that a study has a limitation when there are multiple studies.
Oh,
And then
we're
when
not
you have
saying
multiple studies
I think it's
pointing to-
important to understand that we're not dismissing studies. We're saying that studies have limitations. Do you agree that we would need to get a result? In fact, that was actually what you were saying at the beginning, that we would need to investigate into the results of the studies and to be able to see those results enough times in certain type of pattern before one would make one claim or another. There are a lot of studies out there that come with outrageous claims, and they're not necessarily correct just because one study showed those results. But what I wanted to go into, because of our time limitation, is very much into the area of meth and Adderall, which was one of your premises here in the article. In some way, you're saying that meth is almost identical to Adderall. Could you please educate our listeners as to how?
So when we think about Adderall and methamphetamine, the active ingredient in Adderall is amphetamine, D-amphetamine basic, and there are other amphetamine salts in Adderall, but they don't cross the blood-brain barrier as well, and so people are really just seeking the D-amphetamine. So that's the one I'm talking about, D-amphetamine, that's in Adderall. Now, when you compare D-amphetamine to methamphetamine, when you look at the chemical structure, they look very similar. Methamphetamine has an additional methyl group, and that sometimes that additional methyl group on a drug or a substance can have some wildly different effects. And one of the things that was said about methamphetamine versus D-amphetamine is that methamphetamine, the methyl group, the additional methyl group made methamphetamine more lipid soluble. That is, it crosses the blood-brain barrier more quickly, more rapidly, and that made it more addictive, more dangerous, all of those sorts of things. That's what was said. Now, when you look at the studies, there have now been at least 4 or 5 studies in humans starting in 1971 where you compare methamphetamine to D-amphetamine under double-blind conditions. In all of these studies, you see is that methamphetamine and D-amphetamine produce identical effects on behavior, physiology, mood, and so forth. Now, this should not be such a surprise when we think about what both of these drugs are approved for, because both of these drugs are FDA approved to treat attention deficit disorder because they exert similar effects, almost identical effects. Methamphetamine is also approved to treat obesity, whereas deamphetamine is also approved to treat narcolepsy. And so we've done those studies where we've compared both of these drugs under double-blind conditions. On one day, we give the participants a dose of deamphetamine. On another day, we give them a dose of methamphetamine. Another day, we give them placebo, and we test a wide range of effects, and we also test different doses. And what we find is that the drugs produce nearly identical effects.
And so now it would be maybe changes, cognitive changes, or behavioral changes. Do you feel that there is an increased risk of addiction for individuals who have been prescribed, particularly young individuals who've been prescribed with medications like Adderall?
You know, all of the literature showed that it's exactly the opposite. So people, when you look at people who have attention deficit disorder, for example, when you have a person who has attention deficit disorder and they were prescribed Adderall as a child versus someone who was not, the person who was not prescribed the drug is more likely to have meet criteria for a substance use disorder than the person who was prescribed the medication. So it seems like it's actually protective in people with attention deficit disorder.
And that is what the recent studies do show. And part of what it makes sense from the clinician neuropsychologist perspective and the researcher is that if the brain is behind, which is some of what we see, perhaps some years behind, 1 or 2 or 6 months difference to where we would expect them to be approximately at that age and time, or those difficulties of being able to perform in a certain way, allowing the developing person to receive something that's going to help them function better and continue to go through the processes of learning in order to achieve the development they're supposed to achieve, and have a positive effect overall, which many times has a positive effect overall on their development, is more preferable than having the person not being able to function, not being able to learn, develop then behaviors, maladaptive behaviors we don't want to see, and then perhaps be labeled both by themselves or by their environment as someone that's not able to achieve and etc. Would that be something that you would agree with?
You know, when you talk about the brain being behind, there's no evidence of that. And, you know, there's no reason to go to this brain explanation.
There are scientists, there are ADHD scientists who believe that the brain is somewhat behind. This has been in literature.
You know, there
are
scientists who believe in Christmas and Santa Claus. It doesn't make it right. Or there are scientists who believe in Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean it's true. What we need in science is actual evidence. And I'm telling you, there is no evidence to show that the brain is behind, whatever that means. There's no evidence to show that. I'm telling you that because I've looked at that literature, and there's no evidence to show that the brain is behind.
When neuropsychologists talk about ADHD, from a developmental perspective, so that might not be something you're necessarily going to see in imaging, but when we expect the developing person to be at a certain level of functioning, so this is really has to be differentiated from, as I said, imaging results. When we expect that child to be at a certain level of functioning, and they're not able to meet that, there is the belief by some scientists, again, that might not be something you would agree with, that based on the performance of that child or the developing person, they're not meeting the level that we would expect them to meet at that particular age. But then that as the brain develops, and particularly their frontal lobe, somewhere to their mid-20s, that many of them catch up with that development. So that is something that has been discussed in length in the neuropsychology literature. Again, we might we might not agree on that, and scientists don't agree on everything. But going back to meth and amphetamine use.
No,
and,
no, no, no. That's too provocative. Please let me respond.
Go ahead.
Now, what you just said was I was with you when you were talking about function. The kids may not be developmentally on pace with other kids in terms of various functions, behaviors. I'm with you. I agree with that. The concern is when you go to this brain explanation with no evidence for it. That's the concern.
Right.
I mean, if the kids are behind functionally, fine. I absolutely agree. But this is where scientists and clinicians and a number of people get in trouble when they overinterpret and overstep what they actually observe. There's no data or evidence to suggest or to show that their brains are behind, or even this notion that we have been perpetuating, and I contributed to this 10 years ago, this notion that, well, the prefrontal cortex doesn't develop until the person is in their 20s, and as if that means something. That doesn't mean very much, the way we use it in our language.
Right. It means something to the individuals who actually go through that. And in fact, when you look at the area, for example, of mild brain injury, mild traumatic brain injury, many times an individual will have certain functioning problems after having the injury, but imaging will show none. Just our imaging techniques may not be able to capture changes in the brain all the time. Would you agree that
agree.
our imaging techniques are not as advanced
but
necessarily?
I never made an argument for imaging. That's what you did.
I'm making
I
a
agree.
differentiation.
I'm saying that there is no evidence. That's what I'm saying.
When you say evidence, there are a lot of different things we would say that they are likely to be one way or another, or that clinically we would see them, or that research would suggest one way or another. But having a clear evidence, that's a very tricky thing for anything in research. There are very little things you could say you could have complete proof and evidence for something. But I see
Well,
what you're saying.
I can say a lot about drugs. I can tell you name a drug, and I can name some effects with high level of confidence based on the evidence from research.
Right. Some of the things that we see in research, again, are easy to see. When it translates to functioning and behavior and cognitive abilities, that's a tricky business. Okay, that's a tricky business. And I will tell you that because on our end, clinical neuropsychologists, that's what they need to do. That is their job. And that's not always an easy job. But I will tell you that we have measurements, and we use extensive measurements. And sometimes the picture is clear, and sometimes the picture is less clear. But if somebody scores in the first percentile in a certain particular domain consistently, would you agree we're able to say one thing or another of the likelihood of how that person is performing on those tasks? And then, of course, that gets more complicated on our side. So, comparing to all sorts of other things like age, level of, education, ethnicity, opportunities, what was their pre-morbid functioning, and on we go. So, of course, it is complicated. But I do also understand what you're saying.
I agree. I think neuropsychologists, the tools at their disposal, I think they're excellent. And I'm saying, so I'm agreeing, but the tools at the neuropsychologist's disposal oftentimes are observable behavior. I think they're excellent. I'm not arguing with the tools of neuropsychology.
Okay, sounds very good. Well, I guess we agree. Now, let me see if we can utilize just a little bit more of our time to discuss the area that you're feeling, as you just said, very strongly about. No evidence that we have about substances, and that's where we're going. So when you gave us some more information and education on Adderall and the comparison, and methamphetamine and deamphetamine, essentially, though, those are being prescribed. Right now, individuals, what they know, and this show is for the layman population, so we're going to try and go ahead and tie it into what individuals can benefit from. Many children are being prescribed with either Ritalin or Adderall. What would be the differentiation for you? How would you make a clear picture for the layman in the category of stimulants? How would you make a differentiation for
I'm
them
sorry,
to
what
understand? When
differentiation between what stimulants?
imagine that you need to explain the concept of stimulants to the very simple person. How individuals get told often clinically, you know your loved one is recommended to be prescribed one type of stimulant or another. How does the layman understand some of the differences between some stimulants and others?
So, for example, if you're prescribed Adderall versus atomoxetine or something of that nature, is that what you mean?
Yes.
And how would I describe the difference? I don't know what becomes a preference to a clinician. They may have great reasons to have a preference for atomoxetine over Adderall. One person may say that atomoxetine, for example, has less abuse liability or less abuse potential, and so I think this would be a great medication for this person, your kid, or your loved one, because that person had a problem with stimulant abuse, whereas another clinician may decide that Adderall is a better course of action because they're not worried about the person having abuse with the drug. So that I don't understand completely. It depends what the situation calls for. Is how the clinician will explain. I hope.
Yeah, and that is an area that I believe in the field of medicine, we can do a better job. One of the most common areas that I hear about is that from patient population and also communication to the show is that many individuals say, my clinician didn't explain to me one way or another, didn't explain to me the difference between the medications or their rationale as to why they decided to prescribe one versus the other, or what the long-term side effects are. So that's definitely an area for us to be improving in. Now, in terms of thinking about long-term effects of use or long-term effect of being exposed, you talked about also having experience with clinicians, right, and individuals who are prescribed. And in research, this is an area you would look at. Long-term effects of utilizing prescriptions or being regularly prescribed a stimulant. What are some of the long-term effects or concerns one would have?
Yeah, I think we should talk about the concerns first. Whenever physicians give medications or use medications to treat a condition, the first thing they think about is the risk-benefit ratio. Do the benefits outweigh the risk? That's number one. And if the benefits outweigh the risk, for example, if the person is debilitated as a result of their condition, and then we might easily see that this person could benefit substantially from using medication. And so that's one of the first things that people kind of think about as they prescribe these medications. And now as we think about the long-term risk, so like if you have someone who you want to prescribe a stimulant medication like Adderall for attention deficit disorder, and the person has a mild sort of form of the disorder and you can deal with it behaviorally, it seems like you should not prescribe the medication because there are risks associated with it. For example, we know these sorts of drugs increase cardiovascular activity, and if people are having problems related to blood pressure and those sorts of things, probably not the best thing to do. We also know that these medications decrease food intake, and if people are having problems already with food intake, they can disrupt sleep. And sleep is a critically important bodily human function. So all of these things must be taken into consideration before prescribing these medications. I hope that physicians know this. This is if they don't know this, I'm sure they do. Certainly the good ones know this. And then for the public should also just be aware that every medication, every drug has side effects. every medication, we call them side effects, but they may be the effect. And so we just have to be aware of that.
Absolutely. You touched on multiple areas like sleep, like consumption of food. These are actually very important. And it's important for families and the public to know that, not just to educate clinicians. Of course, we are assuming that there are more good clinicians out there. But it's also the responsibilities of the families, and this show is catered to the public, to understand and learn that areas that's sometimes not reporting to the doctor some things that are going on could be a big problem, could be detrimental for the treatment of their loved ones. If your clinician sees you for a very short duration of time, if it's a physician, okay, not a psychologist or a neuropsychologist who sees you for many hours, okay, for an evaluation, they might not pick up on some of the things that are going on with you. Okay, if somebody spends with you less than an hour, they might not be able to pick up on everything. And you might not be disclosing everything. And by you not disclosing things like an eating disorder, like maybe changes in mood that can suggest that somebody might have a severe mood disorder, which can then affect their likelihood of following through with treatment plan or their reaction to the medication. All of those issues can make a big difference in the success of the treatment. And so absolutely the areas that you're saying are very important. You touched on sleep, and that's a very big one. As you said, it's a functioning that's important for humans. It's essential. When humans do not get sleep, they have very hard time functioning in all sorts of ways. But then we know there are psychological disorders that can affect, like bipolar, can affect not just the quality, but the quantity of sleep that the person receives. So absolutely, what you're saying is very important. And it's important then to inform the clinician. Dr. Hart, I wanted to thank you very much for being on the show today and giving us good information on the substances and how we can actually think also about the substances in a different way, in a more balanced way, and in a more specific way, of course. The differences between an addict to somebody who's using them, and those are topics that we can talk about a lot longer, but also in terms of evidence in research, etc. So again, thank you very much for being on the show today. And we have your book posted. Oh, our pleasure again. And thank you for sharing it and taking your time for that. We've got some pictures of your book, of your recent book, High Price. Wonderful. Dr. Hart, thank you again very much for being on the show.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. So, again, just to recap the topic of substances, reviewing it from a larger perspective, not only just what are the differences between meth and other substances that are related or are in the family of stimulants, as you heard Dr. Hart mentioned about blood-brain barrier, okay? Some of the substances seep in to the brain and affect behavior a lot quicker, okay, than other ones might not. But also, again, you have a good clinician will make a decision as to whether is this the correct particular prescription for that person based on many other factors. They're not isolated. And at the beginning of the conversation, we touched on the area of the likelihood of some individuals, and particularly ones that end up overdosing on, for example, opiates, in terms of whether the individual has been taking other substances as well at the same time. That is a very common problem, actually. Alcohol gets paired many times to other substances at the time of use and can significantly increase the chance of having a morbid outcome. And so and alcohol actually is, every once in a while I cover the topic of alcohol on this show. Alcohol is a major social epidemic and the numbers are quite high, and we are going to touch on it again in the future. But alcohol has its own very interesting effect on the brain and particularly, as we talked about before, memory, but other ones as well, that when it gets paired with other substances, one needs to be concerned. So with that in mind, you can hear that in science, this happens all the time. Scientists may agree or may disagree and feel very passionate about the area that they are investigating and becoming experts in. And the conversation often goes back and forth in the research world via research publications and discussions and reviews. But in general, clinicians focus on what's best for the client that they see in front of them. And research does demonstrate that in certain conditions, and one has to ask themselves which one it's, as we say, risk-benefit assessment. What does that actually mean? It means that when you take a substance, when you are prescribed with a medication, that medication has risks that come with it. And a good clinician and a good patient will do the assessment of discerning, with the risks that come with this medication, what is the benefit that I'm getting? And is that benefit outweighing the risks? More so, some medications come not just with a risk, but they come with long-term effects. Okay, so if the long-term effect could be thinning of the bones, for example, but the benefit is saving the person's life, okay, which one would you choose? Well, obviously, if the medication is going or the treatment is going to save the person's life, it's going to outweigh the long-term effect that is of a lesser degree. So, of course, that decision always has to be made. But again, a good clinician, a good physician or psychologist will inform you, and it is their responsibility to inform you of the rationale of their decision decision-making process, and the recommendations that they came up with, why those recommendations were made. So hopefully, when you guys get any treatment done by a clinician, any service that's given to you, that you do make sure you do get that service properly given to you with ample explanations. With that in mind, I hope you enjoyed today's interview and topic. As you know, you can always reach me with more questions, concerns, and topics that want to be covered. I really do appreciate very much your communication. Please email me at contact@DRDEEGAINES.com, contact@drdgaines.com. With that in mind, I wish you lots of health, hope, and success in getting healthier both spiritually and physically. Be well.
You're listening to The Dr. D Show about neuropsychology and well-being. Get the knowledge you must have to live a powerful, positive life. The Dr. D Show. Here for you.